Remember when King Charles sent a warm public message to Muslims across Britain for Ramadan? Well, Buckingham Palace has just now announced the King won't be delivering an Easter message this year. That led to an outburst of angry reactions across the whole country. Now that reveals something fundamental about the kind of monarchy Charles is determined to create, whether Britain asked for it or not. Today, I will reveal the shocking reason why our Muslim friend ignores the Easter tradition and seems to be very Muslim-friendly lately. To understand why Charles issued a Ramadan message and not an Easter one, you have to go back further than most people realize, back to a man who, long before he became king, was already quietly rewriting the rules. Charles has never been a conventional royal. Even as Prince of Wales, he was restless, impatient with tradition, convinced that the monarchy needed to mean something bigger than pageantry and protocol, and religion was always at the center of that conviction. Here is something most people do not know. As far back as 1994, Charles gave an interview, a remarkable, almost shocking interview for a future king, in which he said he did not want to be known as defender of the faith. He wanted to be defender of faith. One word removed. An entirely different monarchy. That single shift was not accidental. It was a declaration. Charles was signaling, publicly and deliberately, that he saw the crown not as the protector of one specific Christian tradition, but as a kind of spiritual umbrella for every faith community in Britain. Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Judaism, all of them under one royal roof. At the time, the establishment dismissed it as the philosophical wandering of a sensitive, unconventional prince, but Charles never let it go. He carried that idea with him for 30 years, through his controversial years in the 1990s, through the long, difficult wait for the throne, through his remarriage, his rehabilitation, his slow return to public favor, and the moment he became king, that idea, quietly, almost invisibly, began to take institutional shape. What looked like a progressive gesture toward inclusion was in reality the first visible step in a much longer plan, a plan Charles had been building in private for decades. He began cultivating deep relationships with Muslim community leaders across Britain. He visited mosques. He funded interfaith dialogue programs through the King's Foundation. He made it known, through carefully managed signals, that the new reign would be different, but different in ways that would eventually produce a very uncomfortable question. If the King of England is the defender of all faiths equally, then what exactly is the Church of England to him? That question, it turns out, does not have a comfortable answer. But Charles's relationship with Islam specifically goes deeper than most people know. In the 1990s, Charles delivered a now famous lecture at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies, a centre, it should be noted, that he himself helped establish and champion. In that lecture, he argued that the Western world had fundamentally misunderstood Islam. He spoke of Islamic architecture, philosophy, and science with a reverence that surprised even his supporters. He suggested that Europe had more to learn from the Islamic world than it was willing to admit. This was not a diplomatic courtesy. This was personal conviction, and over the following decades, Charles built one of the most quietly extensive networks of relationships with Islamic scholars, leaders, and institutions that any senior British royal has ever maintained. He is a man who has studied Islamic geometry, who has written admiringly about Islamic approaches to the natural world, who sees, genuinely, a philosophical kinship between his own environmental and spiritual values and certain strands of Islamic thought. That is not performance. That is Charles. But here is where it becomes complicated, because sincerity does not exist in a vacuum, and a king's sincerity, when it is expressed publicly, through official royal communications, through the machinery of the palace, becomes policy. It becomes symbolism. It becomes a statement about who this monarchy is for. And when that sincerity produces a Ramadan message, but not an Easter message, the symbolism cuts both ways. To Britain's Muslim communities, it is a gesture of recognition and respect. but to a significant portion of the British public, and crucially, to senior figures within the Church of England, it reads as something else entirely. It reads as a ranking, as if one faith required acknowledgement and another could be assumed, as if the Christian foundation of the British state was so secure, so taken for granted, that it needed no royal affirmation. But here is what makes that assumption so fragile. Church attendance in Britain has been collapsing for decades. Christianity in this country is not a faith that can afford to be taken for granted, and Charles of all people knows that. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for the palace, because Charles is not just the King of England, he is the supreme governor of the Church of England. That is not a ceremonial title. It is a constitutional role with real weight, real history, and real expectations attached to it. And the Church has been watching Charles's interfaith journey with growing unease for years. Senior Church of England figures have, in private conversations reported by multiple sources, expressed concern about the direction of the new reign. Not hostility, not open rebellion, but concern. The kind of quiet, careful, institutional concern that in Church of England terms is practically a crisis. Here is something that almost never gets reported. In the months following Charles's coronation, there were internal discussions within the Church about how to manage what one senior clergyman reportedly described as the interfaith question. How do you maintain a working relationship with a supreme governor who has, philosophically, already moved beyond the institution he is supposed to govern? It is an extraordinary position for the Church to find itself in, and it is made more complicated by the coronation itself, because Charles's coronation in May 2023 was in certain quiet but deliberate ways the most religiously inclusive coronation in British history. Representatives of non-Christian faiths were present in Westminster Abbey in formal, acknowledged roles, not merely as guests, but as participants in the ceremony. That had never happened before. It was widely praised in the press, but inside certain corners of the Church of England, it was noted with discomfort, because the coronation is, at its core, a Christian ceremony, a covenant between the monarch and God, specifically the God of the Christian tradition. Introducing other faiths into that covenant, however sensitively handled, changes something fundamental about what the ceremony means, and the people whose job it is to guard that meaning noticed. But the Ramadan message brought these tensions to a new level. Because a coronation happens once, a Ramadan message happens every year. It is not a one-off gesture, it is a pattern, and patterns, in institutional life, become precedents, and precedents become policy. So the question being asked, quietly, carefully, in the corridors of Lambeth Palace, is this: if the king marks Ramadan every year with a public statement, and does not mark Easter with the same deliberate public acknowledgement, what does that communicate about the relationship between the Crown and the Church? And more urgently, who, if anyone, inside the palace is asking that question on the Church's behalf? But the Ramadan message did not emerge from nowhere, and it was not simply the expression of Charles's personal spiritual convictions. There was a calculation behind it, a deliberate, politically aware calculation made by people inside the palace whose job is to think about exactly these things. Here is what most coverage missed entirely. Britain's Muslim population has grown significantly over the past 2 decades. It now stands at approximately 3.9 million people, around 6% of the total population. More importantly, that community is concentrated in precisely the urban areas where questions about social cohesion, integration, and belonging are most politically charged. The palace is acutely aware of this. Senior advisors to Charles have, according to sources familiar with the discussions, argued for years that the monarchy needs to actively signal its relevance to communities that have historically felt distant from royal institutions. The Ramadan message was, in that context, a strategic communication exercise as much as a personal gesture. It was designed to say, this monarchy sees you, This king is not the king of one Britain. He is the king of all of it. That is a powerful message, and in a country wrestling with deep questions about identity, belonging, and the meaning of Britishness, it is not an irresponsible one. But strategy always has trade-offs, and the trade-off here was the absence of an equivalent Easter message. Now, some context that is important and almost universally overlooked. The palace has, in various years, issued statements acknowledging Christmas. Christmas, of course, is also a Christian observance, but Christmas has become so culturally universal in Britain that a royal Christmas message carries no particular religious weight. It reads as national, not sectarian. Easter is different. Easter is specifically, inescapably Christian. It does not have the same cultural universality, which means a royal Easter message would read, unmistakably, as a Christian statement from a Christian king. And that, apparently, was seen internally as a complication, as something that might cut against the carefully constructed image of an inclusive, faith-neutral monarch. Think about that for a moment. The King of England, the supreme governor of the Church of England, reportedly considered an Easter message too religiously specific to issue without complication. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental tension at the heart of this monarchy, and it raises a question that Charles's advisors have not yet found a clean answer to. Can you be the defender of all faiths without effectively becoming the defender of none? Now here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one has reported on directly, because this is not just about Charles, it is about what comes next, and what comes next is William. Sources close to the Prince of Wales have indicated carefully, with the characteristic indirectness of palace communications, that William does not entirely share his father's interfaith vision. That is not to say William is hostile to other faiths. By every account he is not. But William is, in temperament and instinct, a more conventional royal than his father. Where Charles is a philosopher king, restless and ideological, William is an institutionalist. He believes in the monarchy as a stabilizing force, as something that should reflect the nation back to itself, not lead it somewhere it has not yet decided to go. And the interfaith repositioning of the crown, in William's reported view, risks moving faster than the public is ready for. Here is something that has not been widely reported. In conversations with his own advisors, William has reportedly emphasized a return to what one source described as the foundational identity of the institution. That phrase, foundational identity, is doing a great deal of work. It is a careful way of saying there are things about this monarchy that should not change too quickly. And the monarchy's relationship with the Church of England, with the Christian tradition that has defined the crown for 5 centuries, is one of those things. William has also, according to sources, been quietly deliberate about his own public religious expression. He attends church services, he marks Christian occasions. He is building, slowly and intentionally, a public image that is rooted in the traditional religious identity of the crown. None of this is accidental, but it creates an uncomfortable dynamic, because Charles is still king, and Charles's vision, interfaith, expansive, philosophically ambitious, is the vision currently being executed. William cannot openly contradict it. He is too disciplined, too institutionally minded, to break ranks publicly, but the direction he intends to take the monarchy when his time comes is already becoming visible, and it points in a meaningfully different direction from his father's. What we are witnessing, in other words, is not just a disagreement about a Ramadan message. It is the early outline of a generational shift in what the British monarchy will stand for. 2 kings, 2 visions, 1 institution, and the tension between them is only going to grow. Now here is something the palace almost certainly did not expect. When the Ramadan message went out and Easter passed in silence, the backlash did not come from where they thought it would. It was not just the right-wing press. It was not just the professional commentators who make a living out of royal controversy. It was ordinary people. people who had never particularly engaged with questions about the monarchy's religious identity before, people who simply looked at the contrast and felt something instinctive, something almost pre-political, a quiet sense of being passed over. The moment spread across social media with a speed that caught the palace flat-footed. Screenshots of the Ramadan message circulated alongside the simple, devastating observation no Easter equivalent existed. Hundreds of thousands of shares, comment sections full of people who were not angry so much as confused, genuinely, sincerely confused. Because for most of Britain's history, the monarch's relationship with Christianity has not been a political position, it has simply been a fact, as unremarkable and assumed as the flag above Buckingham Palace. And now, suddenly, it felt like something that needed defending. That shift, from assumption to argument, is itself significant. The moment you have to make the case for something that was previously taken for granted, you have already lost a certain kind of ground. But then the palace did something that in many ways revealed more than any statement could have. It said nothing. No clarification, no acknowledgement, no carefully worded explanation from a senior communications official, just silence. And in the world of royal communications, silence is never accidental. Every word that comes out of Buckingham Palace is considered, weighed and approved through multiple layers of review, which means the silence was a decision, a deliberate, considered, strategically approved decision. What that silence communicates is this: we anticipated this reaction, we considered our response, and we chose not to give one. Because giving one would mean engaging with the premise, and engaging with the premise would mean acknowledging that there is a tension worth explaining, which the palace clearly does not wish to acknowledge. But here is the danger buried inside that calculation. Institutions do not collapse through single moments of crisis. They erode, slowly, quietly, through the accumulation of moments where people feel unseen, where the institution that exists to represent them appears to be looking in a different direction. The Church of England has been living through exactly that erosion for 30 years, and the palace's silence on Easter, repeated, patterned, deliberate risks, beginning the same process for the monarchy itself. But pull back from the controversy for a moment, because what this story is truly about is something far larger than a missing Easter message. It is about the kind of King Charles has chosen to be, and it is about whether a monarch can pursue a deeply personal ideological mission while still fulfilling the constitutional obligations the crown demands of him. Charles is, by any serious measure, one of the most intellectually restless monarchs Britain has produced in generations. He thinks, he reads, he holds convictions. He is not content to be a ceremonial presence who waves from balconies and reads speeches drafted by civil servants. He wants his reign to mean something. He wants to leave the institution different from how he found it, and in many ways that ambition is genuinely admirable. But here is where it becomes complicated. The British monarchy does not derive its authority from the personal vision of whoever wears the crown. It derives its authority from continuity, from stability, from the sense that it represents something larger and more permanent than any individual monarch's beliefs. The moment a king begins leading rather than reflecting, begins pulling the institution toward his own vision of what Britain should become, rather than representing what Britain already is, he is taking a risk that sincerity alone cannot protect him from. Charles has decided, clearly and deliberately, that Britain's future is plural, multi-faith, multicultural, post-Christian in its public institutions, even if not in its private lives, and he is using the most visible symbolic institution in the country to signal and accelerate that transition. But there is a question at the center of that project that he has never directly answered. Is that the king's role? Is it the function of the monarchy to lead cultural change? Or is it the function of the monarchy to reflect the nation, not as one man believes it should be, but as it actually is? The Ramadan message without an Easter equivalent did not happen by accident. It was a choice, deliberate, advised, considered. and choices made by kings carry a weight that outlasts the news cycle in which they are made. Charles is writing the opening chapters of his reign's legacy right now, and the question of whose faith he is defending and whose he is quietly setting aside will be part of that legacy, whether he intends it or not. But this is where the story stops being about Charles entirely, because the decisions being made right now about which faiths the crown acknowledges, which traditions it elevates, which it quietly allows to recede, will not be undone when Charles's reign ends. They will be inherited by William, by George, by the generations of the monarchy that follow. Britain is changing. Nobody serious disputes that. It is more religiously diverse than at any point in its recorded history. Christianity, while still the largest single faith on paper, is declining rapidly as a lived, practiced tradition. Islam is the fastest growing faith community in the country. A monarchy that refuses to acknowledge that reality is a monarchy that risks speaking only to a Britain that is already fading. Charles understands this. His interfaith project is a genuine, serious attempt to keep the crown relevant to a genuinely plural nation. But relevance purchased at the cost of identity is a fragile thing, because there is a version of this project, the version the Ramadan episode points toward, where the crown, in trying to speak equally to all faiths, ends up with no clear voice of its own, where the historic Christian architecture of the British state, woven into its oaths, its parliament, its constitutional foundations, quietly becomes something embarrassing to acknowledge, rather than something to carry with confidence. William sees this risk. The Church of England sees it. And the next decade will determine which vision wins. If Charles can demonstrate through consistent action that his interfaith ambition includes rather than displaces the Christian foundation of the crown, the tension may be managed. But if the pattern holds, if Ramadan is marked and Easter is not, if the Church of England increasingly resembles a guest in an institution it once defined, then William will inherit not just a crown, he will inherit a question his father never answered. And questions left unanswered by kings have a tendency to become crises for their successors. So let's be clear about what we have actually uncovered here. This was never a story about a forgotten Easter message. It was a story about a king with a mission 3 decades in the making, a mission that has quietly unsettled the Church of England, reportedly concerned his own son, and produced a public silence from the palace that speaks louder than any statement. Charles has made his choice. He has decided what kind of monarchy he wants to build, and he is building it deliberately, patiently, and without apology. The question is whether Britain, in its entirety, was asked. Whether the people who have always understood the crown as a specifically Christian institution were consulted before that understanding was quietly set aside, and whether William, when his time comes, will continue his father's mission, or gently, firmly begin to walk it back. We want to hear from you. Do you think Charles was right? Is this the monarchy evolving as it should, or drifting from something it should have protected? And what should William do when he becomes king? Tell us in the comments. If this video gave you something to think about, please like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one.